I want to mention, first up, I might mention again, but I know people will be leaving to catch planes, that the deadline for applications for heading north is coming up soon. That's something which is very important to our ties with the American Association, and very definitely having attended those meetings, a very worthwhile experience to see both a lot of points in common, but also a lot of different things about how the American profession organises itself. So the final event of the conference is the Distinguished Fellows Address. We've had a great slate of Distinguished Fellows this year, and in their honour we have Tom Hertel, and it's a really great pleasure to have Tom here from the both, of course, he's the president of the American Association, professor at Purdue, but also I had the pleasure of attending the GTAP, Global Trade Analysis and Policy, I guess the PEERS conference in Penang last year, which was just a really great event, and I think it's the profession in Australia has been moving to a large extent to focus more on resource issues, but I think the fundamental role of agriculture in feeding the world is something we can never forget about, and trade obviously is a big part of that. The general looking at the balance of supply and demand for crops, I think, is something which is a topic which I always like to hear more about from people who've done the work and found out about it. So that as I'm really looking forward to this talk. Tom's going to talk for about 45 minutes. We'll have a little bit of time for questions. We may have to eat slightly into afternoon tea, but I hope not too much. And so over to you, Tom, and Robert.
Well, it's a great honor to give this address to the Society here. This visit has special meaning for my wife Adriela and I. This is our 20th anniversary of a first and very memorable sabbatical we took at Melbourne Uni that helped shape much of what we've done subsequently. So we owe a lot to Melbourne. It's great to be back here. Thanks for the invitation, John. I'd like to congratulate the organizers on an excellent meeting. I found it very stimulating, lively. I like just the spirit of the meetings. It's been very enjoyable, and one of my goals in coming here is indeed to strengthen this already very valuable and productive relationship between our two societies. I think there's further things we can do. We're talking about some joint symposia that we might organize, among other things, and so I'm looking forward to that. The title of my talk, given to me by John, and perhaps I edited his version slightly, assessing the extensive margin supply and demand for global cropland in 2050. And I want to acknowledge right up front important assistance from Aares, a grad student at Purdue University, first-year PhD student who's been a great help in putting this talk together. Well, I'd say about 1.5 years or 2 years ago, I started thinking, gee, I've been working for a long time on economic growth and agriculture, more recently on biofuels, and also on potential for greenhouse gas mitigation in forestry and agriculture. How does this all add up? Are we asking the same hectare of land in 2050 to provide all these different services, to be feeding 9 billion people a much richer diet, a more land-intensive diet, to fuel our cars, and potentially, according to some integrated assessment models, actually providing power into the grid through bioenergy, to meet the increased demand for residential and commercial real estate, growing with population, growing faster than population. There's the biodiversity demand that's growing. Carbon sequestration, we just had a very nice couple presentations on that. Potential there, but also potentially putting additional demands on lands. All of this as we're experiencing climate change more rapid than had been expected in the past. So does this add up? That's what this talk is about. And can economics bring any further insight to bear on this issue? So I'm really picking up where Phil Pardee left off in his presidential address. For those of you who weren't there, I'll just recap. He looked at a long, it's an excellent talk, a long time series of data on agricultural production productivity. So looking at the output side of things, I want to look at the input side of things, at the land and resources required to do that, and where that land is experiencing these other environmental, potentially environmental pressures. When I started reading about this topic about a year and a half ago, I think we now have Aares has put together a Zotero library for me with 300 references. There's a lot that's been written on global land use. And remarkably little of that uses economics. The geographers are all over this topic. The ecologists, the climate scientists, we're a little corner of that. And where the economists have had a role in this, I would argue that the perspective hasn't been sufficiently long-term. And furthermore, that we haven't always had the spatial resolution we require for that. So those are a couple of arguments I want to develop here. I'm going to start out right up front with the analytical framework, a very simple one, the simplest possible analytical framework that brings what this profession has to offer to bear on this issue. We'll look at factors shaping the demand for land, factors shaping the supply of land, and a critical evaluation at the end. So the framework I have in mind, as I say, the simplest possible framework I could think of that helps me make sense of the literature out there. If we think of the world's agriculture as one production function, okay? And this produces all the food, fiber, and fuel coming from agriculture. It employs two classes of inputs. There's the land and the natural resource inputs that are in limited supply. And there are the variable inputs that are effectively in perfectly elastic supply over the long run. Their opportunity cost is determined by the rest of the economy, whether it's labor, capital, even fertilizer. So you potentially, by substituting those variable inputs for the land and resources, you can increase yields in that way in response to scarcity. The usual assumptions about cost minimization, entry-exit leading to zero economic profits over the very long run seems plausible to me. So I'm going to use this model to solve for a very simple expression that explains what drives the change in land use in agriculture, or in crops in particular, between today and 2050. So the drivers in this formulation will be demand growth, okay? Food, fiber, fuel growth, growth in demand for output. Trend yield growth. I'm saying trend because that's typically the way it's portrayed in the literature, that there's some exogenous force at work that's leading to greater yields in the future, setting up a bit of a foot race between demand on one hand and yield growth on the other. And I'm also interested, because there's a significant literature on reductions in the supply of agricultural land for urbanization, biodiversity, and other purposes. So those are the drivers of this model. And more formally, these are given the notation delta. Delta means it's a shock to the system, okay? So the first delta, when I'm talking about this, will be demand for agricultural products. The second delta will be relate to the derived demand for land or yield growth. The third will be shock, will relate to the withdrawal of land from agriculture for other purposes. There are three key economic margins of response in this framework, and I think they pretty much capture what economists have to offer in a broad brush sense to this issue, and what's often missing in most of the literature. One is the tendency of consumers to consume less agricultural product when commodity prices rise, the price elasticity of demand. The tendency for yields to increase endogenously in response to scarcity, so a yield response, or the intensive margin of supply response, and the extensive margin, which is in the title, and that is the expansion, the potential for expansion of agricultural area in response to price changes. So if we put these various things together and solve this model for the long-run change in cropland over the next 40 years, in response to these drivers, the deltas in the numerator, we see that the role of the economic variables, or the elasticities, is to act as a bit of a shock absorber on this system. So at the top we have the same expression repeated again, and I just want to talk about that a little bit and get you in the mood for what I'm going to then subsequently discuss in the talk. So first of all, stronger economic response, that means larger elasticities, either on the intensive margin, ability to respond to scarcity by increasing yields, or consumers' ability to substitute away from food. Both of those act as shock absorbers. Because they're in the denominator, they reduce the amount of land required to meet a given profile of demand growth and of those exogenous drivers of the system. A really important point that's lost in much of this literature is that land use change depends not on the absolute size of this intensive margin, but the relative size. What's intensive relative to extensive? Demand response relative to the extensive margin. Okay? So think about the case where all these elasticities were 0.1. Okay? They were all equal. Well then, each of these margins would absorb a third of that biofuel shock that we fed into the model, say, a shock to the numerator. How is that going to be absorbed? The economic system will dampen that, and a third of the adjustment will come through reduced consumption, a third through higher yields, and a third through more area. A special case and maybe justifies just putting this expression together in its own right is the assumption that's been employed by the FAO and its long and very valuable contributions to this literature, long-run projections in agriculture. Implicitly, they assume that the intensive margin elasticity, the demand elasticity, are both zero. Okay, so this expression just collapses to a foot race between these demands being exerted by population and income growth and biofuel growth and the yield growth. Okay, so they build up those deltas in a very elaborate way from very disaggregated country data, taking into account many considerations. So excellent work, but it is overstating the land use change just because it's missing these economic components. And I know on their agenda is to build more economics into their long-run projections, and that'll be great. Those are really the things they need to be thinking about in the future in modifying their projections. Okay, that's the framework we have in mind. Now I want to use this as an organizing framework for talking about the literature, what's known out there, what isn't known, and we're going to start on the demand side. Population, okay? A nice discussion of this in Phil's talk. I just want to highlight a few points. One, I'm very envious of the demographers. They have a much better track record of projecting what's going to happen because most of these people have been born already and their reproductive patterns are somewhat predictable. Although it is striking how fertility, a very striking development in the last 25 years has been, in fact, that fertility in most of the middle-income Asian nations is now at or below replacement levels. That is somewhat unexpected. There's the question mark about China. Could there be a snapback, a relaxation of the one-child policy? Could have implications. But essentially, we're looking at a period of time now where, even though we're adding 2 billion people from 7 to 9, the 6 billion figures from 2000, we're adding a couple billion people. The rate of growth in population is much slower than we've seen in the past. So the fact that we've been able to keep up over the last 50 years is encouraging. Most of the, according to the demographers, most of the net growth in population will be in developing countries, and most will be in cities. That'll have implications in terms of the urbanization infringement. I'll get to that shortly.